Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into what it takes to build a high-performance athlete.
Oh, yeah, this is going to be fun.
Yeah, and we're going to be using a chapter from Debra Shogan's book as our guide for this exploration.
A great choice.
It really is. She goes into some fascinating ideas like, have you ever heard of the concept of docile bodies?
Oh, yeah, that's a really intriguing concept, and it ties in perfectly with this whole idea of athlete development.
Yeah, and also how, and this is something that I think people don't think about enough, how the rules of a sport are actually what allow for skill to even exist.
It's kind of counterintuitive, right? You'd think rules would limit things.
Yeah, exactly.
But actually, they create the framework.
Exactly. So we'll unpack all that and more.
So let's get started then.
So Shogun starts with this big argument that creating these incredible athletes, these high-performance athletes, is basically a project built on discipline.
Yeah.
And she uses Foucault's ideas about power and knowledge to kind of back that up.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe give us a little more context on how Foucault's ideas fit into all of this?
Yeah, Foucault can be a little bit dense sometimes, right?
Why?
But what Shogun's getting at is how these systems, these methods of training and knowledge, like all the techniques that they use, they work together kind of hand in hand to shape these athletes.
Okay.
So it's not just some coach yelling at you to run faster, lift heavier.
Right.
It's much more about the sort of systems and the environment that these athletes are, immersed in.
So it's almost like they're molded by the system.
Exactly.
Okay, and I think a good example of that Shogun brings up is the rules of the game,
Uh-huh.
right? She's saying that these rules, even though they might seem like they're limiting, they actually make it possible for skilled play to emerge. It's like this paradox. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. If you didn't have rules, if you didn't have that structure, it wouldn't even be a sport, would it?
Right, it'd just be chaos.
It would just be chaos, exactly. And so these limitations, they actually end up being what allow for those amazing displays of skill.
So it's almost like those limitations spark creativity.
Exactly.
So Shogun connects this to Foucault's concept of what he calls disciplinary power, which, that phrase can sound a bit, scary.
Right.
Yeah. So how does that fit into this whole discussion of athlete development?
Yeah, so disciplinary power isn't about like repression or control in a negative sense.
Okay.
It's more about shaping individuals through these specific practices and this knowledge that's been built up over time in the sport.
Okay. So can you give us a real world example, maybe something our listener can relate to?
Yeah, so think about the training regimen that an athlete goes through, right? The strict schedule, the constant observation from their coaches, the development of specific techniques. All of those are examples of disciplinary power in action.
So it's like the whole system is designed to shape them into these high-performing athletes.
Precise.
Okay. It's fascinating, but it also makes you wonder, where's the line? At what point does it become too much?
Yeah, that's a very valid concern, and that's actually where Shogun introduces this concept of docile bodies.
Docile bodies. Yeah, that sounds a little intense.
It does, right.
That does.
But in this context, docile doesn't mean submissive or weak or anything like that. It's more about the athlete's ability to be shaped and trained through those disciplinary practices that we were just talking about.
So it's like their body is almost like clay being molded by the potter.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And as a result, you get these incredible performances, these amazing displays of skill and athleticism.
So they're fine-tuned instruments almost.
Precisely.
It still kind of raises the question though of at what cost?
Right.
What about the athlete's own individuality? Do they lose themselves in the process?
That's a really important question. And Shogun definitely brings up some ethical considerations around this whole concept of docile bodies.
Yeah.
She asks, is it always a good thing for an athlete to be so dedicated to their sport, so focused on achieving that peak performance?
Right.
Could it come at the expense of other aspects of their lives?
Right. Their personal lives, their mental health, their education.
Exactly. Shogun acknowledges that while discipline is crucial, it can also be a bit of a double-edged sword.
So how does she address this tension between the need for discipline and the potential downsides?
Well, one thing she emphasizes is that athletes aren't robots. They're not just blindly following orders.
Okay.
They bring their own unique identities and experiences to the table, which complicates this whole idea of a completely docile athlete.
So they're not just blank slates. They're coming into the sport with their own baggage and their own personalities.
Absolutely, and their own values, their own beliefs, and all of that shapes how they respond to those disciplinary practices.
Right. She also talks about how athletes have these multifaceted identities, right? Like their gender, their race, their sexuality, their ability. All of these things are intertwined with their athletic identity.
Yeah.
How do those other identities kind of complicate this idea of the docile athlete?
Well, that's where things get really fascinating because sometimes those identities can clash with the expectations and demands of the sport. Because
Okay.
it's not always a perfect fit, right? And that's actually where she kind of launches into this discussion of a new way of thinking about ethics in sports.
Oh,
Instead of just focusing on rule breaking or scandals, she argues that athletes and coaches should really critically examine the power structures within their sports and how they impact different individuals.
so it's like less about policing individual athletes and more about questioning the system itself.
Exactly.
That's pretty radical.
It is. It's a pretty significant shift in perspective. It's really thought-provoking. And it forces us to consider, like, what does an ethical approach to athlete development really look like?
Wow, this is already giving me a lot to think about. And I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of Shogun's ideas.
There's so much more to unpack,
Yeah.
and we're just getting started.
Well, I can't wait to dive in further then.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear more about what she proposes in terms of this new approach to sport ethics.
Yeah, let's do it. It's funny, because Shogun uses these game rules that we were just talking about to illustrate that idea that limitations can actually be productive.
Yeah.
She argues that it's the rules themselves, the ones that seem like they're holding you back,
Uh-huh.
they're actually what makes skilled play possible in the first place.
It's like she's saying that boundaries can actually be a catalyst for creativity.
Exactly. And without those constraints, there wouldn't be any framework for athletes to, really showcase what they can do.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, think about basketball for a second.
Okay.
If you took away all the rules, no dribbling, no out of bounds, no three-point line, would it even be basketball anymore?
It would just be like running around with a ball.
Exactly. It would just be chaos.
Right.
And it's those rules, that structure, that make it a sport.
It's like having a conversation, but there's no language,
Yeah.
It's just
It's just noise.
exactly, yeah.
So those rules, that structure, that's what allows for communication. And I think that's a really good analogy for sport.
Yeah.
And Shogun uses this idea of the rules of a game as kind of a metaphor for how disciplinary power works in shaping athletic performance.
Okay.
So those limitations, those rules, they create the conditions for those amazing skills that we see.
So the restrictions actually become a source of power for the athlete. That's interesting.
Right. And the more they can master those skills within those boundaries, the more they can really kind of exert their influence on the game.
Right.
I mean, think about figure skating, right? Landing a quadruple jump.
Oh, yeah.
It's the constraints of the ice, the physics of the jump that make it so impressive.
Right.
Or a gymnast on the balance beam, it's that narrow beam that makes their movements so incredible.
Yeah.
It's like those constraints push them to achieve things that wouldn't even be possible otherwise.
Right.
And what Shogun is saying is that this power isn't just something that's handed to them by a coach or a rule book. It's not like they're just puppets, right?
Right.
It's about them, the athletes themselves, internalizing those practices, internalizing the rules, and really embodying them.
So they're not just following instructions. They're becoming a part of the system.
Exactly.
They're almost co-creating their own power in a way.
That's a really great way to put it.
Yeah.
And Shogun actually takes this even a step further.
Okay.
She argues that this whole process, all this discipline and skill development, it actually creates what she calls bodies of knowledge.
Bodies of knowledge. What does that mean?
So it's not just about physical ability, it's about all the knowledge and the understanding.
Okay.
Becoming ingrained in the athlete's very being.
So it's like years of training aren't just building muscle memory, they're actually shaping their minds too.
Exactly. It's like they develop this deep, intuitive understanding of their sport.
Okay.
Think about a point guard in basketball,
Okay.
like a really seasoned point guard.
Mm-hmm.
They just seem to know where everybody is on the court,
Yeah.
where the ball needs to go. It's like they have this sixth sense almost.
Yeah, or a soccer player who anticipates their opponent's move before it even happens.
Right, exactly. It's like they're reading the game on a whole other level.
Yeah.
And what Shogun's getting at here is that this body of knowledge, it extends beyond the athlete themselves.
Okay.
It includes their coaches, their trainers, the sports scientists.
Oh, wow.
It's like a whole network that contributes to creating these high-performing athletes.
So it's like a collective intelligence almost.
Yeah, it's like a shared understanding
Right.
of what it takes to be great at that sport.
Yeah.
And that knowledge is passed down and refined over generations.
That's fascinating.
It is. And, language plays a really big role in this, too.
Oh, yeah.
Shogan talks about how the way we talk about sports, like the words we use for talent, for dedication, even for winning, it shapes how athletes are trained and evaluated.
So the stories we tell about sports actually have a real impact on the athletes themselves.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And that language is often shaped by the people in charge, the coaches, the commentators, even us as fans.
Yeah.
So it's not just about physical training, it's about the whole culture surrounding a sport.
Right, the narrative.
The narratives,
Yeah.
and how those narratives can either empower athletes or limit them.
That's a really good point. So where does Shogun go from there?
Well, that's where she starts to unpack the ethical implications of all of this.
Okay.
She argues that while discipline is super important, it can also have its downsides.
Right, yeah.
Too much emphasis on, conformity could actually stifle an athlete's individuality,
Right, because they might be coming from a different background, they might have different values
Exactly.
that might clash with the expectations of their sport.
Exactly. And this is where I think Shogun's work gets really, really powerful, because she's challenging us to rethink how we approach athlete development,
Okay.
to create more inclusive system, a system that celebrates each athlete's unique qualities.
So it's not about creating athletes who are all the same. It's about valuing their individuality.
Exactly. And that leads directly into her idea for a new approach to sports ethics.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I'm really curious to hear more about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about this idea of the docile body and how athletes are shaped by the rules and systems of their sport.
Yeah.
And it's super fascinating, but I can see how it could raise some ethical questions too.
Absolutely.
Like, where do we draw the line between, discipline and control? At what point does it become too much?
Right. And Shogun acknowledges that all this intense training and pressure to conform, it can create this feeling that athletes lack agency, like they're just, cogs in a machine.
Right. It's like we're sacrificing their individuality in the pursuit of athletic excellence.
Yeah.
Like, are we creating a system that produces amazing athletes, but maybe not well-rounded people?
Yeah, and that's exactly the concern that Shogun brings up.
Oh,
She asks, is it always a good thing for an athlete to be so dedicated to their sport, so focused on winning, that it overshadows other parts of their life?
right. Yeah. Like their personal relationships, their education, their mental well-being.
Exactly.
Are we setting them up for success in life, not just in sport?
That's the key question. And
Yeah.
Shogun's work really pushes us to think beyond that win-at-all-costs mentality,
Okay.
to consider the athlete's well-being, not just their performance on the field or in the gym or
Right.
whatever.
So it's about creating a system that values athletes as whole people, not just as performers.
Exactly. And that's where her new approach to sports ethics comes in.
Okay.
It calls for a much deeper understanding of the power dynamics in sports.
Okay.
Recognizing that athletes aren't just passive recipients of training, they have voices, they have their own perspectives,
Yeah.
and they deserve to be heard.
So it's about giving athletes more of a say in their own development.
Absolutely. It's about empowering them to advocate for themselves, for their own needs and interests.
So not just blindly following what the coach says or what the system dictates.
Right. It's about creating a more collaborative, more equitable environment
Okay.
where athletes are active participants in shaping the future of their sport.
So it's like shifting the power dynamic from this top-down model
Yeah.
to something that's more shared, more participatory.
Exactly. And Shogun believes that this shift is absolutely essential
Okay.
if we want to create a more ethical and sustainable future for sports.
So it's not just about changing the rules or, throwing money at the problem. It's about like a fundamental shift in how we think about athlete development.
Exactly. A paradigm shift.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating stuff.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive.
It really has.
We started with the role of discipline and those really fascinating ideas from Foucault. Then we kind of unpacked this whole concept of the docile body. And now we're talking about like reimagining sports ethics.
Yeah, it's amazing how it all connects, isn't it?
It really is. It
Yeah.
really is. And Shogun's work, it really forces us to think critically about what it means to be a high-performance athlete.
Yeah.
It's not just about like natural talent or physical ability. It's about all these other factors.
About the whole system.
The system, the rules, the power dynamics, the ethical considerations.
It's all intertwined.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that athletes are complex people.
Right.
navigating a complex world. And I think the big question that Shogan leaves us with is, are we creating a system that actually supports them, that empowers them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And if we encourage athletes to really question those systems, to question those expectations,
Yeah,
how might that change the future of sports?
that's a great question, yeah. What would a truly equitable and empowering system actually look like? That's something to ponder for sure.
A lot to think about.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive into Debra Shogan's work. This has been really enlightening.
My pleasure. I always enjoyed these conversations.
And listeners, if you're interested in learning more, we highly recommend checking out her book. It's a really thought-provoking read that will definitely challenge your assumptions about the world of high-performance athletics.
Sure.
Thanks for joining us.